Hello there, my name is Mr. Beasley, and this video is all going to be about summarising the main events that happen in Act 3 of Romeo and Juliet. And Act 3 contains some of the most significant and pivotal events in the whole play. It's an interesting point to make before we really get going, that if Shakespeare had chosen to end the play at the end of Act 2, it would have had many of the features of a Shakespearean comedy. These plays tended to be thematically concerned with lighter topics like love. The lovers are often separated and they're presented with a number of obstacles that they've got to overcome before they're eventually reunited in marriage at the end. And the language often contains puns, and humour is created in this way. However, it is this act, and in fact the first scene of this act, which transforms the play completely and turns it into a tragedy. The setup to the action that we see in Act 3, Scene 1 is that Romeo and the Montague boys have gate-crashed the Capulet ball as a way of trying to distract Romeo from his low mood. While at the party, Romeo is recognised by Tybalt, who instantly wants to fight him but is prevented from doing so by his uncle, old Capulet. Tybalt vows revenge, and the following morning challenges Romeo to a duel by a message sent to his house. Romeo is not there to receive the message because he spent the morning arranging his marriage, catching up with his friends, and then returning to Friar Laurence to marry Juliet. The scene begins with Benvolio and Mercutio discussing the hot weather, and this can lead to short tempers. Benvolio says, "I pray thee, good Mercutio, let's retire. The day is hot. The Capels, which means the Capulets, are abroad, and if we meet we shall not scape a brawl. For now these hot days is the mad blood stirring." And I think we can all relate to the idea that when it's stifling hot, we might be a bit more fractious than usual. Benvolio is worried because he knows the Capulets are around as well. And remember, from Act 1, that broadly speaking, Benvolio is portrayed as a peacekeeper, and so he urges Mercutio to go home. I say broadly speaking because of what Mercutio says in reply, which is basically an accusation that Benvolio is just as short-tempered as anyone else in Italy. He says that Benvolio has drawn his sword on a bartender for no reason after he's had a couple of beers, and that he's argued with a man who coughed in the street because the noise woke his dog. Now, this doesn't sound like Benvolio at all, and yet he does very little to deny it. At this point, Tybalt arrives, looking for Romeo. Mercutio is unhelpful and uncooperative, and in another series of puns, he deliberately misinterprets what Tybalt is saying. For example, when Tybalt says, "Mercutio, thou consortest with Romeo," Mercutio replies with, "Consort, what dost thou make us, minstrels?" which puns on the word consort, which Tybalt uses to mean to speak with. But a consort is also a group of musicians, and so Mercutio makes it appear as though Tybalt is insulting them. He even continues this in the following line as he gets his sword out and says, "Here's my fiddlestick, here's that shall make you dance." Benvolio urges the pair of them to calm down as the citizens of Verona have started to take notice of the escalating argument, but he's ignored, and, just as tempers are peaking, Romeo arrives, fresh from his marriage to Juliet. Now, this detail takes on extra significance as legally he and Tybalt are now related through marriage. So when Tybalt calls Romeo a villain, Romeo replies with, "Tybalt, the reason that I have to love thee doth much excuse the appertaining rage to such a greeting." Romeo's politeness and continued refusal to fight angers Mercutio, who calls it vile and dishonourable, and subsequently chooses to fight Tybalt himself. Romeo, remembering perhaps the prince's warning, tries to intervene by saying, "Gentlemen, for shame, forbear this outrage. Tybalt, Mercutio, the prince hath expressly forbid this bandying in Verona streets." And as he tries to part them, Tybalt thrusts with his sword under Romeo's arm and stabs Mercutio. Tybalt runs away, and Mercutio is left bleeding in the street, supported by his friends. The wound is mortal, but despite this, Mercutio continues to make puns and jokes, such as, "Ask for me tomorrow and you shall find me a grave man," where, on the one hand, the word grave can mean serious, but also dead. In his final and probably most famous speech, Mercutio curses both the households of Montague and Capulet by saying, "A plague are both your houses." Romeo recognises the part he played in his friend's death and suddenly turns from lover to fighter and instantly seeks revenge. "Away to heaven," he says, "respective lenity and fire-eyed fury be my conduct now." Now, I said at the beginning, it could be argued that this is the scene which is the catalyst for the inevitable tragic conclusion to the play. And one of the features of tragedy is that the main character needs to have some fault, some flaw in personality which will lead to their death. And for Romeo, this flaw is his impetuousness, his actions which are done rashly and without proper thought. He finds Tybalt. They fight, and against the odds, Romeo kills him. Almost instantly, Romeo realises the devastating consequences this action could have, and before Benvolio ushers him away, Romeo calls out, "Oh, I am Fortune's fool." The remainder of this scene is taken up with the arrival of the prince, and Benvolio recounting to him what has just occurred. Lady Capulet is there too, and she demands that Romeo is executed, but instead the prince decides to banish Romeo from Verona. If he's found inside the city walls, he will be killed. In the next scene, the action switches to inside the Capulet mansion, where Juliet is alone and unaware of what's happened in the streets of Verona. She is waiting and praying for the day to be over and for the night to come because, as was traditional, after a wedding the couple would spend their first night together and consummate the marriage. When the nurse arrives carrying the rope ladder that Romeo is going to use to climb into Juliet's bedroom, she is obviously agitated, and Juliet asks what news it is she brings. The nurse, in typical bumbling fashion, makes a bit of a hash of it, and at first Juliet believes that she's being told that it's Romeo who's dead. When the truth of the situation is discovered by Juliet, it's her turn to use a series of oxymorons to describe her feelings towards Romeo, the husband who killed her dearest cousin. Beautiful tyrant, fiend angelical, dove-feathered raven, wolfish ravening lamb, a damned saint, an honourable villain. The nurse rails against Romeo for what he's done, saying, "There's no trust, no faith, no honesty in men." And then shame come to Romeo, and Juliet replies with, "Blistered be thy tongue for such a wish." And so Juliet remains loyal to her husband. After further outbursts of sorrow from Juliet, the nurse says that she will go and seek Romeo, suspecting that he will be with Friar Laurence. The nurse's suspicions are correct, and the next scene transports us to the friar and Romeo. At this point, Romeo is unaware of the prince's sentence, and when he's told, he acts as though he would rather be put to death than separated from Juliet. The friar says a gentler judgment vanished from his lips, not body's death, but the body's banishment. And Romeo replies, "Be merciful, say death." And the friar repeatedly tries to counsel Romeo, saying that the prince has been merciful and Romeo is being unthankful, but Romeo will not hear. And this passionate exchange between the two of them is only broken by the knocking of the nurse at the door. She tells the friar that Juliet is exactly in the same sorrowful mess as Romeo is, and when Romeo asks how she is, the nurse replies with, "Oh, she says nothing, sir, but weeps and weeps, and now falls on her bed and then starts up, and Tybalt calls, and then on Romeo cries." And at hearing how upset his actions have made Juliet, Romeo produces a dagger. And the stage directions here say he offers to stab himself, and so it would be very much up to a director to decide how genuine this suicide attempt is. At this point, the friar becomes angry with Romeo and calling him wild, womanish, and an ill-beseeming beast. And after the long speech which follows, this climaxes with the logical reasoning of the friar saying, "Tybalt will kill thee, but thou slewest Tybalt. There art thou happy. The law that threatened death becomes thy friend and turns it to exile. There art thou happy. A pack of blessings light upon thy back. He then tells Romeo to go to Juliet, but make sure that he's out of Verona before the morning. Romeo must go and stay in the neighbouring city of Mantua, but the friar reassures Romeo, saying that after a time, when things have cooled down a bit, it might be possible to beg pardon from the prince and welcome Romeo back to Verona. But other events will intervene to make sure that this scenario never happens. One particularly significant event is revealed at the beginning of scene 4, where Paris has come to woo Juliet, as Capulet advised him to do back in Act 1, Scene 2, but clearly Juliet is in no mood for this, and so she doesn't come down. And then, in complete contrast to his attitude at the beginning of the play, Capulet, almost inexplicably and certainly unexpectedly, says that he will make a desperate tender of my child's love, believing that she will do as he says, and tells his wife to go to Juliet and inform her that a Thursday, tell her, she shall be married to this noble earl. Now this is in just 3 days' time, and this, of course, puts Juliet in an even more desperate situation because, of course, none of these characters know that she's already married. The final scene in this act is a long but important one, and it begins in Juliet's bedroom after the lovers have spent their first night together. There are, as previously mentioned, a lot of images of light here, candles and meteors and torches, with the overall impression being that the sun is coming up and therefore Romeo must leave for Mantua. This is a tender, loving scene, and it's also significant to say that it will be the last time that Romeo and Juliet see each other alive. The nurse arrives, saying that Lady Capulet is coming to her room, as we know from the previous scene, with the message from old Capulet about her imminent marriage, and so the parting is hurried, with Romeo leaving out the window. You need to imagine Romeo lowering himself down from the balcony and Juliet looking over it, seeing Romeo beneath her, when she has a sort of premonition about their ill-fated future. She says, "Oh God, I have an ill-divining soul. Methinks I see thee, now thou art so low as one dead in the bottom of a tomb." And fate will conspire to make sure that the next time Juliet sees Romeo, it will be exactly under these circumstances. When Romeo is gone, Lady Capulet enters the bedroom. Juliet is crying, and Lady Capulet interprets these tears to be for Tybalt, but these will either be for Romeo or fake tears as some sort of distraction. There is an exchange between mother and daughter in which Lady Capulet vows revenge, and Juliet speaks carefully about her desire to see Romeo as well. Indeed, she says, "I never shall be satisfied with Romeo till I behold him dead." With Juliet apparently upset, Lady Capulet tells her daughter that her father has sorted out a sudden day of joy, which is intended to cheer her up. When Juliet is told the news of Paris and the marriage at St. Peter's Church, she is shocked and furious, saying, "He shall not make me there a joyful bride." When Capulet arrives in the next few lines, he's told of his daughter's refusal, and then the scene erupts into a furious tirade of insults from old Capulet against both his daughter and the nurse who tries to intervene. He shouts at his daughter, saying, "Hang thee, young baggage, disobedient wretch. I tell thee what, get thee to church a Thursday, or never after look me in the face." He threatens to disown her, to cut her off from family entirely, and at one point it even appears that he might strike her when he says, "My fingers itch." When Capulet and his wife leave, Juliet and the nurse are left alone, and Juliet is looking for comforting words on how this second marriage could be prevented. And the nurse's advice is this: "I think it best you married with the county, that's Paris. Oh, he's a lovely gentleman." Juliet says that the nurse's advice has comforted her, but this is not spoken in earnest. She asks the nurse to pass a message to her father that she's gone to Friar Laurence to confess her sin of disobedience. And when the nurse has left, Juliet reveals her true feelings. "Ancient damnation, O most wicked fiend," she calls the nurse, "thou and my bosom henceforth shall be twain." And this is Juliet speaking about her closest confidant, calling her names and saying that she will never confide her true feelings to the nurse again. And the scene ends with Juliet reaffirming that she will go to the friar to seek his advice. And if there is none, at least she still has the power to kill herself.